Welcome back to Alberta Primetime, and the vocal point now. Police want the power to seize excessively speeding drivers' vehicles on the spot. Is that what Alberta roads need, or is it too much power? Our Wednesday crime panel brings in former Edmonton Police Chief, President of Rayner Consulting, Fred Rayner. Defence Lawyer Rod Gregory is also here with us tonight from Davidson Gregory Daniluk. And from the Calgary Herald, Justice and Social Issues reporter Jason Van Rassel. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Hi, Jennifer.
Edmonton Police Chief Rod Knecht, who is also president of the Alberta Association of Police Chiefs, is preparing to ask the province to give officers the power to confiscate vehicles of drivers stopped for excessive speeding. He says this year traffic deaths are double last year's rates, and 14 of the 25 deaths so far this year in Alberta are speed related. Fred, that new power sounds like it also lets police become judge and executioner on the scene. Is it too much?
I don't know. I think when you look at the doubling of fatalities in our experience here, if last year homicides were all the issue and people asking what are the police doing about homicides, this year it's all about traffic fatalities and why is that doubling. So I think you got to remember too, he's looking for a tool to go after the worst of the worst drivers. This isn't for somebody that's 5-10 kilometers over the speed limit. These are people that are doing 160, 200 kilometers an hour within on roadways within a municipal jurisdiction. I think that's grossly reckless, and whatever tool you can use to either dissuade them from that kind of behavior or physically take the device away from them, I think it's a step in the right direction.
And what's shocking is they are doing those kind of speeds that you mentioned, the offenders. Here are just a few of the recent speeding cases that Alberta media have reported from information provided by various police agencies around our province. The numbers are shocking. Rod, the confiscation idea is for extreme speeders. Do you have concerns, though, about giving police the extra power of confiscation on the spot?
Well, how long are they going to confiscate the vehicle for? Is it a temporary period or is it for the long term? And obviously, if it's for the long term, I think it's in excessive of what ought to happen. But the public also may not realize that when people are caught speeding at those excessive speeds, above 50 kilometers over the speed limits, typically when they actually have to go deal with their traffic tickets, it is a mandatory court appearance. It's not a mail-in, and typically those people have their licenses suspended for a minimum of 30 days, sometimes 90 days, and they receive huge fines, $2,000, $2,500 fines, so they're not the small $250 tickets.
I guess maybe then the problem is that as severe as that sounds, it's not working. Jason Knecht says Edmonton police routinely charge drivers doing 200 on city highways and 140 in urban 60-kilometer-hour speed zones. Every region sort of has a joke. Is Alberta's that we have a speeding problem and not so funny?
In a word, yes. Let me put it to you this way. I think many people would agree nowadays that impaired driving is a problem. You look at the social stigma that's attached to it. You look at the ad campaigns, just generally not accepted as a thing to do. Well, if you look at the numbers, speeding actually kills more people in Alberta every year. Alberta Transportation did a 4-year study not too long ago that basically attributed 30% of fatalities to excessive speed. Let's look at the year 2010, and that's sort of the last year where we have some of the last complete statistics. 351 fatalities. If you extrapolate that out, that's more than 100 fatalities due to excessive speed. In the same year, about 60 impaired drivers were responsible for fatalities. So, while I'm not really comfortable with with a rule that would allow police to confiscate a vehicle at roadside, I share some of Rod's concerns. Yeah. I really do think it's time, though, for society to really start moving in that direction where we view speeding with the same kind of severity and stigma that we do impaired driving, because it really does kill a lot of people every year, more so than impaired driving.
A really good comparison, Jason. And Fred, other provinces such as BC, Quebec, Ontario already have enacted this legislation. Has the measure worked elsewhere?
I think you've got to look at what their, how long it's been in effect in those jurisdictions and collect some statistics over a certain period of time. I think they didn't invent this though out of the gate themselves. Whatever they drew upon for justification to implement it in those jurisdictions, they must have had some data there as well.
The problem when you mentioned, Rod, the fines and the suspensions, there are something like 155,000 known suspended drivers caught driving in Alberta every year. So if the suspensions aren't working, they're still hitting the road, they're still perhaps doing dangerous behaviors. You represent these kind of clients. What does work? What does get through?
Well, I think the suspensions do work, and there's other things that the government has in place to deal with speeding, people who drive at excessive speeds. The first thing is when they amass certain number of demerits on their driver's abstract, they can be called in before the Transportation Safety Board. They can get modified licenses, restricted licenses, all of those things. So the question is how many more people should be brought in and have their license privileges restricted. The other thing is if someone's going at highly excessive speeds in an urban area, the police can charge those individuals with dangerous driving under the criminal code. They're not hamstrung to just issue a speeding ticket.
Okay. Jason, some people comparing this confiscation idea as well to the driving with a blood alcohol level above 0.05, where there can be instant measures. You talked about the drunk driving. Is the speeding the same category? It sounds like you're thinking yes.
In a way, yes. It's again, my problem is with the sort of confiscation at roadside and how that affects someone's right to due process. But again, to go with the point that I had before, if we can all agree that impaired driving is a problem and have severe penalties for it, I think it's time for society and for our lawmakers to really start viewing speeding that way.
Next up, restorative justice gains a new foothold in the East. Are Albertans ready for more sensitive sentencing and penalizing the innocent? What's wrong with background checks? We're back in a moment. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and the Wednesday Crime Panel. When Dalhousie University students find themselves in trouble with the law now, they have another option. The school is offering restorative justice. Their cases could be handled by university staff instead of the courts. Rod, this will be the first program of its kind at a Canadian university, but there are still a lot of fans of tough on crime. Will Dal's program work?
Well, I'm proud to say that Edmonton's actually much further ahead than the East in this area, and Edmonton has the Alberta Conflict Transformation Society. They work very closely with the prosecutors and the Edmonton Police Service, and they divert quite a few files right at the police level to restorative justice and mediation. And that society also works in the schools and in the community. So we're actually quite a bit further ahead than the East.
Jason, that said, are there enough standards, training, and performance measures for restorative justice? Does it need those kind of things to grow and gain more of a foothold in Alberta?
Sure it does, but I think as Rod alluded to, this isn't exactly reinventing the wheel. There are models there that Dalhousie can look to for inspiration. And if I'm not mistaken, Dalhousie has a very good law school, so I would hope that there are some people qualified there to administer this program.
Fred, about 11 Alberta restorative justice programs get small funding, really, when you consider it. $351,000 a year from the province, I think, is the last number. Is it difficult to convince police and the tough on crime crowd that it works?
I don't think it's tough to convince the police these days, certainly here in Edmonton. Big fans of restorative justice. We've seen the law evolve into alternative measures, and then the Youth Criminal Justice Act and some of the alternative processes that it has there. And we've had experience with it. When you look at things like recidivism, and you look at individuals that are processed traditionally through the courts, who go through the court system, pay a fine, have whatever punishment sentence comes out of that, versus the alternative measures or a restorative justice program. it's night and day. It's like 80% are open to recidivism, to repeat the offense at some point in the future if you go through the normal judiciary, whereas with recidivism, it's almost reversed, 80-20 the other way. So it's a successful alternative to standard court process.
And yet, Rod, maybe a lot of naysayers, skeptics don't believe that. The stats would speak for themselves, but is there an effort to convince more Albertans that it should get more funding?
Well, it's amazing what those groups do on that skeleton budget. It really is. And the most critical part are the people who are involved in those programs who can train and can enable the restoration and the mediation between the parties. Those people are really the most critical ones. And the Edmonton Police Service have specific officers actually assigned to vet files to go to those people who have the specific training. So the prosecutors are on board, the defense lawyers are on board.
What about the victims?
Well, they have to want to participate, and that's the first step. And again, the statistics say that their experience is much more positive in the restorative justice model than it is just showing up in court and filing a statement with the judge. And this is actually codified in Australia. They're leaps and bounds ahead of us.
Another topic today, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association issuing a report this week calling for more fairness and clarity about dealings with police that can show up on citizens' background checks. Right now, if you aren't convicted, charges can still appear without much context, hampering job applicants, volunteers, and even travelers. Jason, would most people, a potential employer, for example, be able to distinguish between criminal charges, convictions, the various items police might have on your background check?
To my mind, the big issue isn't whether they can distinguish between a criminal charge and a criminal conviction, but whether they choose to or not. A lot of fair-minded Canadians would say, do the crime, do the time, and I think many people can agree with that. I think where the issue here lies is whether innocent people are going to be stigmatized or screened out of a job because of a false accusation or a crime they ended up not being convicted of in the first place. Just having that on your record is something that someone may notice, may look at, and may decide between you and somebody else. I think we can all concede that maybe in some vulnerable sector checks, when it comes to people working unsupervised with children, that extra level of scrutiny may be necessary. I think where the concern here is somebody going for a job that has some sort of youthful indiscretion or being in the wrong place in the wrong time, resulting in a criminal charge that eventually gets dropped. Right. Yeah, and that ends up following them around unnecessarily. I don't think it's fair.
Rod, why are police services and some judges seemingly so reluctant to remove items that other judges have ruled as unreasonable?
Well, Jason hit on that. It's the secondary safety check, and it's funny that this topic came up today because I had the mother of a former client of mine send me an email telling me how well her son has been doing in the last 2 to 3 years and had gone through some very difficult times. He had all of his charges dropped, and now he's applying for work, and he's being hindered because of this secondary check that shows an incident, yet he doesn't have any convictions, and he's upset and his family are upset, and it's going to hinder him.
Is it something that needs to go case by case, Fred?
Well,
in terms of removing items from a record?
That'd be ideal, but you got to remember the Edmonton Police Service is filing over 200,000 cases a year. And so the best way is to create policy and filters at the higher level so that you can govern these types of things.
Thank you all for your insight tonight. Great to have you on. Former Edmonton Police Chief, President of Rayner Consulting, Fred Rayner, from Davidson Gregory Daniluk Defence Lawyer Rod Gregory, and the Calgary Herald's Justice and Social Issues reporter, Jason Van Rassel.